I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and Katie Kitamura is one of my favorite writers. I'm just going to own that right now. And I have so been looking forward to this conversation. The Audition is her newest novel, and we're going to come back to that in a second, but you may know her from A Separation and certainly Intimacies, which I know I'm not supposed to claim favorite novels, but if I were to actually do a top 10, if I ever did do that, Intimacies would be right there. There are also a couple of early novels, The Longshot, which is a novel about, of all things, mixed martial arts fighting, which every time I think about that book, Katie, I just go, how? We might come back to that. And also Gone to the Forest, which, honestly, if you're going to write a novel about colonialism, that's the way to do it. But, Katie, I'm so happy to see you. Thank you so much for making the time.
Well, I'm so happy to be here.
You started, though, working on Audition when you finished Intimacies. It sort of went back to back, yeah?
It was back to back. I mean, I had the idea after I finished A Separation, and I had that idea and I had the idea for Intimacies, and I was trying to decide which one I would do. And I couldn't quite crack it open in some way, so I wrote Intimacies, and then by the time I finished Intimacies, I think I'd figured out something about the book, and I started writing Audition definitely back to back. I mean, I would have started writing it before Intimacies was published.
I mean, I think of A Separation, Intimacies, and Audition as sort of a set. I don't want to say box set, but I do think of them as sort of a very linear Katie Kitamura experience. And I want to talk about voice, because I also went back and reread Separation and Intimacies all the way, because you pick them up and you cannot it is impossible to read sort of 10 pages and refamiliarize yourself with the narrative. And the voice is so wonderfully unreliable and pointed. And can we start with voice?
Yeah, I mean, they're completely in my head, 3 books that are talking to each other. They have very similar voices. They have very similar preoccupations. You know, they're books about performance, about interpretation, about passivity and agency, I think. They all have these unnamed female narrators who speak the words of other people for a living and are surrounded by writers, I think, in the case of all 3 novels, often male writers. But the voice is, I mean, there's some variation, but it's a very consistent voice across all 3 books. And I had struggled for a long time to write in first person. I found first person really challenging as a voice. I felt self-conscious. Writing first person felt too authoritative in a way, and I think control is a kind of really fraught aspect of writing for me. I don't like to exert too much control, and yet that's everything that you have to do as a writer. So, I mean, maybe we can talk about that later.
Yes, we have to.
You know, but I mean, I think my general position is to abdicate authority in life and definitely in fiction. And so for that reason, first person was a difficult voice for me to get my head around. And then I think when I realized that I could use first person to talk about uncertainty, to talk about not knowing, not simply to be unreliable in a kind of, you know, Nabokovian way.
Right.
I love Nabokov, but, you know, not in that kind of quite powerful, muscular way, but in a kind of quieter way, a kind of writing my way into a state of unknowing. Once I thought about voice in that way, then the first person suddenly became just a delight for me to write. You know, I think often the characters will kind of posit something, and then they'll kind of go at it again, and then a second, a third time, and they kind of look at it from multiple angles. And that sense of getting a kind of multi-perspectival, 3-dimensional assessment of an idea or a person or a situation is kind of present through all 3 books.
Unreliable, though, to me is a good thing, right? I don't actually want my narrators necessarily, especially in something that is so, you write on a sentence level that is so delightful to me. I don't want to assume anything about the books when I go in. Right? Like, I just want to say, okay, I'm going to hand myself over to the story, and I'm not sure I trust entirely what's happening, because I think genuinely the narrators have no idea really what's happening. And I love that. And I love uncertainty, yes, is a much more accurate word, but unreliable to me is there's a messy humanity to it.
Right.
And yet the contrast with the sentences and the structure of these novels, A Separation is the longest of the three, right? At like 225 pages?
I think they've actually been shrinking.
Well, yes, but you do so much. Wait, hold on. Now I have to look at my galley for Audition because
shorter.
Audition is 197.
It's shorter, yeah.
But the ground that you cover and the way we sit with these characters, I mean, part of what I think of when I think of these three novels too is, there's a little bit of Marguerite Duras in there. There's a little bit of Jean Rhys in there. There's a little bit of Didion, right? And you might get some people saying, well, those women are writing the same, and actually in Duras' case, I mean, she did write The Lover twice. You have The Lover and then the North China Lover. But the idea that we can sit with uncertainty and that we can sit with not knowing and that we can ask questions about performance in more than one way. I mean,
it's in the kind of, it's actually quite hard in a way to sustain unknowing and to not tend toward closure. Okay. Because narrative, as it exists in the culture and as we consume it, is always tending towards closure. It's always tending towards explanation. And I actually have to be quite conscious of not doing that, because I think, there's always a narrative explanation. I mean, when I'm teaching, I sometimes tell my students, narrative explanations are actually not difficult to come by. They're everywhere, not so much in life, I don't think, but everywhere in the fiction that we consume, in the television and in the way people tell stories, of course, in novels. To keep a story open is to me the real challenge of writing fiction. And I think certainly with Audition, I wanted to keep it open in really multiple senses of the word. And I think it is the most open-ended probably of the books that I've written, because there are a couple different ways of reading it. But I think, like all of those writers that you mentioned, you think about the end of Good Morning Midnight. It is really devastating. It's kind of one page and an entire that's an event at the end of that book that many novels place in the middle and do setup and then aftermath. But you just kind of tax it on at the end, and it completely transforms your sense of the novel. But it also does this thing that I think is quite magical, in that it kind of opens a door. So you think, oh, this world continues and we don't see it, but there's an open door at the end of this novel. I think Chekhov's Lady with a Lapdog does the exact same thing. On the final page, suddenly you see that rather than tying up the story with a kind of narrative bow, he's untied that bow and he just let everything kind of fall apart in a really beautiful and productive way. So those are incredibly high standards, but that's kind of, as a reader, that's what really thrills me. And I think as a writer, you can't help but, try to emulate the things you admire as a reader.
But I also think as a writer, and you mentioned control earlier, I mean, you have to have an incredible amount of control to be able to let aftermath flow. And flow might sound like a strange way to describe aftermath, but you can't. I think we've all, as readers, been stopped dead in our tracks when something happens in a book and you're like, oh, that doesn't feel organic. That doesn't, I mean, as much as we never learn the names of your narrators, which I love, I feel like what happens to them and the way they recount these stories and the people that they encounter is all very organic. That it's very, you can't just drop one of these women into the other's story, right? Even though the sort of structure is not dissimilar, they are uniquely who they are. And yeah, there is that overlap of performance, but translation, interpretation, acting. I mean, you could argue writing.
I mean, why do I want to write about this? It's because it's a way of writing about writing, obviously, without having to have like a novelist as my central protagonist. Right. I mean, they are. I mean, they kind of. I mean, I think you said they operate in a kind of linear trajectory, and I think that's right, which I hadn't thought about until now. But A Separation is like a novel about total passivity.
Mm-hmm.
It is about somebody who is so, in a way, wrecked by grief, mm-hmm. which she can't even acknowledge or perceive, and which she comes to acknowledge towards the end of the book. But there's a way in which it's a novel very much about paralysis, I would mm-hmm. say, and the paralysis of grief. With Intimacies, I was really interested, of course, in thinking about passivity, but I think also more specifically about complicity and where passivity and complicity touch. And the central character is an interpreter at a war crimes tribunal, and I wanted to think about what it meant for her to be part of that institution. And then the question becomes, what is she going to do about it? So mm-hmm. toward the end of that novel, there is a way in which she steps forward into her life, and she starts to make these active decisions, and the kind of the ethical problems of passivity start to become quite pressing for her. Audition, I think she's a much more active character in mm-hmm. a lot of ways. There's several moments when she kind of realizes that she is the kind of agent of chaos mm-hmm. inside the novel, and she's not used to thinking of herself in that way. But it's a moment when she says, "Oh, I'm the problem. I'm the one that kind of people are having to react against. I'm the one that people have to adjust to." So there is a kind of shift, but she is doing a lot of this quite, as you say, unknowingly. I mean, the issue of control is, as I said, something that I think about a lot. I mean, Audition was a novel in which I was eager to give up control in some ways, in the sense that I think it's a novel that is designed to be open to interpretation, and there are a couple of different ways that you can read it. And there's a line in the book where the character says that a performance is made in the space between the audience and the actors, and clearly that's also true of a novel. And I was trying to very much to write about that and write that into the book. The kind of quandary for me is that in order to enact that, it actually requires, as you said, quite a lot of control. You have to be controlling what the reader knows at various points. And all of that is a little bit, I get uncomfortable with I don't even like to have a prose style that is too seamless or controlled. I like, but unfortunately, I think it's not as messy as I aspire to aesthetically, maybe.
Too late. Those sentences are like cut glass. It is too late for you to... I mean, we certainly have the messiness of life, and I'm just thinking of a lot of the interpersonal things that we see. I mean, we see our narrator and, Isabel, Christopher's mother, in A Separation, and certainly our narrator really between the boyfriend and the friend's brother and the friends. I mean, she just is not fully prepared for life in 3 dimensions, right? Yeah. And then we have the protagonist in Audition, and I have to say, I do love all of these women, but it was fun watching her figure out where things stood. And you'd go back and think, wait a minute, hold on. And I'd flip back. And sometimes I was just like, oh, right, of course. There were hints throughout. But I want to talk about her marriage, because I feel like this is the first time you've actually really sort of tackled marriage in a way. I mean, the marriage is absent in A Separation. Mm-hmm. And Isabel's marriage with Mark is what it is. It's not particularly extraordinary. It's just a thing that happened. But this marriage in Audition, I don't know, it feels like it's something new with you.
I mean, it's the first of the 3 novels where the male partner or the romantic interest is actually in the book. Because in A Separation, I killed him off. In Intimacies, I sent him to Portugal, I think, after 1 or 2, maybe 2 scenes, maybe even just 1 scene. And, at the time, I think I was interested in how much narrative tension you could produce around absence and desire. I think in this novel, the desire is pointing in a way. I mean, it's tricky, but in a way, it's pointing in another direction. It's very much pointing outward. And I think I was very much wanting to write about a couple in the middle of their life who've been together for a very long time, who love each other unequivocally. I mean, there is no sense in which I wanted over the course of this novel for the reader to question that they loved each other. I think that's a much more open question in both the separation and intimacies. It was more a question about how they were going to navigate the middle of their lives together, and this kind of dawning sense, that the horizon is rapidly approaching, and the perimeter of your life with another person is suddenly not abstract. It's really there at a certain point, and certain possibilities are no longer there or present. So I think I was just interested in what does that look like? What does it suddenly mean? Like, you have a happy, functioning, fulfilling marriage, and is it not enough? And what does that mean? And so I thank you for asking that question, because people have tended to focus very much on the relationship with the younger man in the novel. But to me, the relationship that carries the most weight is actually the relationship, is actually the marriage.
In a different way, it makes me think of Danzy Senna's Color Television, the marriage in that book as well, where it's just like, yeah, clearly, it's messy. There's a scene where the husband sits down and he starts eating macaroni and cheese that he's just made out of a box. And she's like, oh, yeah, he's going to feed me. And no, he just sits down next to the TV and starts eating mac and cheese. And who among us has not been there when you're just like, hi.
I love that novel so much. I love Danzy as a writer. I think she's a really phenomenal writer. It was funny. I mean, this is like I've been sent, we had the same editor, and I've been sent a kind of copy of the book. And I remember I was reading it before bedtime, and I just, I could not stop laughing, and I would laugh and laugh and laugh. And my husband was lying next to me, and he kept saying, "What's so funny? What's so funny?" And then at some point he said, "I'm feeling kind of jealous that something else is making you laugh so much," because he's very funny, and he makes me laugh. He brings the humor into my life in so many ways. But I could feel he was growing agitated because I was having this kind of private moment with Danzy's book, and it was bringing me so much pleasure. Yeah, that's not relevant really to our conversation, or maybe it is. I don't know.
Not entirely, but the idea that marriage, honestly, isn't just, that sort of, I have a million different issues with, listen, you want to get married, go get married. That's great. But when I see how we present, it's all or nothing. This conversation has been all or nothing since Jane Austen sat down and said, dear reader. And I do want to talk about how we talk about marriage and how we see it and how we use it to drive narratives. And I sort of felt like you were doing something I hadn't seen in a really long time. I mean, outside of color television, like, I don't feel like we're having conversation. Like, there are plenty of marriages that go absolutely pear-shaped, and then we get great novels about divorce, and that's good too. But we've come sort of through this spate of books where it's like, marriage is the worst thing ever. Let's burn it all to the... And, again, it just goes back to this idea of all or nothing, but watching how things play out. And again, it's partially that open-endedness, right? Between your narrator and her husband, and watching them both change around each other is wild. It's so satisfying.
I mean, it's interesting. I think you're right in the sense that there is the kind of conventions of fiction demand that you look at either the beginning of a relationship or the end of a relationship. The middle is often not considered terribly interesting. As somebody who is married and in a long relationship, the middle is fascinating to me. I mean, how does it sustain itself? Because it's not that nothing is happening in the middle. It's very quantifiable in the beginning. It's very quantifiable in the end. You can almost track the steps leading up to both of those things, and that's been done in fiction many times. The middle is much more mutable, and the narratives are not as fixed, and that's fascinating to me as a writer. I think what is actually happening. It's also the stakes when you say, will these people marry or not, or will these people get divorced or not? Those are very obvious kind of, I don't want to say artificial, but those are very novelly narrative stakes. So, I'm always interested in thinking about what happens when you take away the kind of obvious stakes of a situation, and then what does the writing need to do to kind of fill that? And I just thought the stakes aren't, it doesn't have, you shouldn't think, are they going to stay together or not? But once you remove that question, it allows you to turn your attention to the kind of madness of marriage as well. That it's mad and it's very moving the way people learn to accommodate each other, and things are lost and things are also very much gained in that. But I mean, the intimacy between the couple, which is built on this very, very long history, and this sense of these small deals they've almost made with each other over the course of their marriage, and kind of uncovering those deals. I mean, deals is maybe too crude of a word, but it's not unlike that actually in the book. I think there are certain demands that are placed by the husband on the wife and vice versa. And so just kind of trying to unpack that was fun and interesting to me.
I think we can use deals without having it be transactional. I mean, you do. I mean, there is navigating that just happens, and especially in shared space. But the idea, too, whose career is at the front and whose career is sort of off to the side and whose career is up and coming. I mean, I think we can talk about the thing you do in the middle, because, I mean, talk about a hinge moment, right? Talk about a hinge moment in a 197-page book. But the idea that we have sort of three versions, we open in a restaurant, there's an older woman, younger man seated at a table, and there are three different versions sort of running through people's heads of what this relationship is. And then you do a thing. When you close that scene, you do a thing.
Yeah.
And I get it, and I love it. But as a writer who wants to exercise control or not exercise control, however we're talking about control, it's a really interesting choice.
When I started writing the book, I thought I was going to write a book about a couple and a kind of young man who inveigled his way into their lives. And I thought what I was interested in was kind of seeing how maybe these three characters would together build this kind of fantasy in which they were a family.
Right.
And I thought, when I started writing, I thought, I can do that kind of slip into a kind of fantasy shared space, and I can show that slow progression. And then I thought, I was writing, and I thought, I actually know how to do this. I mean, I know how to do that tracking. I know how to do that progression. It's something that is, it's not a huge feat or anything. So I hope this doesn't sound like I'm bragging, but it's like something that's kind of within my wheelhouse as a writer. And I thought, what if I don't do that? And what if I actually take a big jump instead and do something that, that is a little bit scary? And it was scary. I mean, the entire time I was writing the book, I kept saying to my husband, Harry, who's a writer as well, and who does quite formally ambitious work, I kept saying, I don't know if it's going to work, but at least if it doesn't work, I know I can do it the other way. And so that was kind of my feel. I know I can write a kind of psychologically realist novel, and I can sing. I'm pretty sure I can do that. But I want to try to do something that is actually formally much more ambitious, and that would work as a kind of Moebius strip in a way, where you would have to decide as a reader which half of the book you thought was real and which half of the book was fantasy, and how those two halves kind of sit together. So that became the ambition of the book, and it was both frightening and really exhilarating. And I think I wanted to take some risks, because I think as a reader, my sense is that I can tell when a writer knows they know how to do something. There's a kind of complacency that's into the prose, and everything works perfectly, and they're incredibly gifted, and I admire these books so much, but it feels on some fundamental level that I don't know what's at stake creatively. And so I think I just felt, if I'm going to write a book where I feel like I have the skill set to execute the demands of the book, then it's actually, there's nothing at stake in the way that there needs to be something at stake. And so that was how I kind of came upon this idea of this hinge, is actually just to take a big jump and see if I could get the reader to follow me.
I mean, the first time I read the book, I'm just sort of thinking about what my initial response was. Well, I yelled when I realized what you were doing because that was great. But also the second time, though, I felt like the first half of the book fits into the second half in a way that I hadn't really thought about the first time I read. The first time I read it, I was like, oh, I get it. This is very cool. But I sort of read them as two halves of not even a Mobius strip, but like straight up like, okay, here we are, you know. And the second time I really felt like the people we met in the second half of the book had obviously wrestled with the first half.
Yeah.
And somehow they had come to this point because of what had happened in the first, like it was just, the relationships felt tighter on second read. And I know it's me, honestly. I know it's entirely me, but it was really satisfying to be able to take 200 pages essentially and get two almost entirely separate reads out of it. Like that, the pleasure of that. Because you don't know, I mean, sometimes you go back to something and you're like, oh, I remember why I loved this when I was younger. Or,
yes.
Oh, I understand why I raced through this the first time I read it. And now I don't want to do that again. Or, yeah, I need to race through it again.
It's, I mean, that was my my dream or my hope was that it would be like two books, that there would be two completely different versions book. And one is, as you say, is I think the way it sounds like you read it the first time, and the second is the way you read it the second time, where everything that's happening in the second half is referring to the first half. I have that experience with the book that I reread the most, which is Henry James' Portrait of a Lady, which I first read when I was a teenager, maybe shortly after I moved to England, actually. And I totally thought that was a novel about a young American making her way in the world. And then I read it like a few years later, and I was like, oh my God, this is a novel about like the destruction of this woman. I mean, it just it changes every single time. And the thing I truly do believe is that books are made by their readers in a really fundamental way. And I you know, I know that a book, when I'm reading a book, I mean, this is why I think I'm actually quite a reluctant book reviewer, because I know how much a book changes depending on what mood I am, what's happening in my life, the kind of set of prejudices and predispositions that I bring with me to a text, the things I've read in general, the things I hope to, all of that is my baggage, and the book is kind of buried under the weight of that. And so I you know, and I think especially as you get older, your taste becomes in a way more and more confident. And I think it's an incredible skill and a gift of the book critic to be able to kind of separate that out a little and to keep their taste open. So I've now drifted really far away from your.
No, you haven't. No, you haven't, because it actually opens me up to talk about interpretation and translation and how those are not actually the same act.
No.
And the way we talk about women in novels, which you don't do, and this is part of why I love your work, you know, this idea that women are, you know, sort of naturally empathetic and that we are, you know, caretakers and that we want to make sure that everyone is okay. Those are not the women that we get in your books. And even with our last protagonist in Audition, like she tries to do that and it doesn't always work for her. She's just really not okay with it. She's like, why am I doing this? Why can't I just live my life? But I love this idea that we can flip that narrative and to have that messiness, right? That dissonance, that like, why am I supposed to be the warm, fluffy one all the time? I mean, and there are dudes who are very good at being warm and fluffy.
I mean, it's interesting the kind of, there are many men who are, I mean, who are warm, and I'm surrounded by warm and fluffy men in life.
Yeah.
In my own life. I mean, I think it's interesting the kind of demand for women to display their emotions. Like it's like Coriolanus displaying his war wound. It's kind of like, you know, you must expose yourself to the reader, and that's fine. I think, and I think there's a lot of great fiction that does that. But there surely has to be more than one mode of depicting the emotional life of a woman, I think. And also, I would add that like emotion is not only warmth and expressiveness and kind of like display. I mean, coldness is an emotional, you know, reticence is all of these things are emotional and psychological states. They're just not the ones maybe that we associate with women's fiction.
I think there is also sort of an expectation, though, that those are not the things we want. We're not supposed to want to see reticence and coldness unless someone is a bad guy, right? Unless it's, you know, the person who's throwing a wrench. I mean, there are the heroics and, you know, all of that. And there's this idea, right, that, and yes, you're grieving. You're supposed to show your grief, right, instead of just acting strangely. And I would rather, it feels more emotionally true to me to see someone making a bad decision because they're blinded by grief and have no idea that they're blinded by grief. I think that's a much more genuine human response than I'm going to go do X, Y, and Z because here I stand grieving. I'm still laughing about the Coriolanus and the whirlwinds thing. I'm like, only Katie would whip out Shakespeare in the middle of this conversation. It's great. I love it. I love it so much. And it's totally true.
But I mean, it's like the equivalent of the, you know, it is like, I mean, it's obviously that kind of interplay of public display of emotion. And private experience is something that I've been interested in for a very, very long time. You know, in a separation, as you indicated, a part of the book is concerned with professional mourners, who are people who are paid to express the grief of people who are not able to directly express their grief. And that's something that I'm very, very interested in. I mean, a movie that I love is Krzysztof Kieślowski's Blue, Three Colors trilogy. And the entire film is about Juliette Binoche, who is in a state of extreme and quite complex grief.
Right.
And who cries a single tear at the very, very end of the film. And for most of the film is going about her day-to-day life in this incredible stillness and kind of frozen rage and grief, and people kind of are finding it odd that she doesn't grieve in the way that she doesn't perform her sorrow for them, and she kind of refuses to, and that's her small act of kind of defiance in a way, is that she refuses to perform for people and for the culture as they want her to, and there has to be this kind of tremendous shift in her before she is finally able to express some part of that grief.
I mean, part of why I love a novel, and it doesn't always have to be 600 pages, and sometimes it can, you know, be 225, is the interiority and watching the change and the revelation. And sometimes the revelation isn't exactly what the protagonist thinks it's going to be. And I like that slippery slope, and I'm just wondering if you can even... Are you at a place where you can still surprise yourself? I mean, I know we've just talked about the big hinge moment in Audition, but that's a structural thing. That's less of a voice character story thing.
There's a quote from Hervé Le Tellier's novel, The Anomaly, and it's a kind of, you know, mid-list, middle-aged writer who has a kind of, you know, shrinking number of readers and feels kind of crippled by his lack of success, and he kind of wonders, why do I keep writing? And then he says, because, I'm paraphrasing, but it's something like, because if he managed to write one sentence that was more intelligent than he was, then that miracle would make a writer of him. And I think that is what we're all in it for, is we're hoping that we will do that thing, or not even that the book, that the text will do that thing that will surprise us, and that will be more than what we are consciously capable of doing. You know, I was talking to Yasmin Zaher, this novelist who wrote The Coin, and she talked about the subconscious of her book. And she said, and I love that idea that the book has its own subconscious that is separate to her subconscious, but that things are unearthed from it, and that bubble up to the surface and then recede again. And that's part of, I think, the kind of organic logic of a book, that as a writer, you're always hoping to achieve, that it has a kind of integrity in and of itself. It's interesting, the question about voice and surprise, because I think without question, the voice, which is, I think, pretty consistent across all three books, but in A Separation, I was learning to do it for the first time. And so there was a lot more wrestling with it. And now it is something that I think comes to me with greater ease. But I'm very naturally suspicious of ease in all things. I mean, I'm the person who refuses to take a Tylenol and rather would suffer with a headache for hours. But I mean, I'm suspicious of ease in art making, I think. Yeah, so I think it's that's something. So I think maybe that's part of why I kind of made this structural change. I think it's also, I've always had this kind of conflicted relationship with plot. In that
I do know that.
where plot is the great contrivance of fiction. It's the thing that I'm always like, oh, I've got to do it, but I don't want to do it, and I know how to make this work. And I mean, there's always a moment when a writer, which is when you're writing, when I think in the life of a writer, I think there's always a moment when, for the first time, you write something and you realize it could be moving to people, and then maybe the second time you realize that you know how to do that, and it's a device, and that's really upsetting. That's really, really upsetting because you don't want to manipulate. I'm not like Hitchcock. I don't want to have like electrical cords in people's brains and to make them feel emotion just by pressing a button. That's not the way I want to make work. I think so. So all of these mechanisms by which you know that you can kind of evoke emotion, those are very kind of suspicious to me in a way. And yet plot is wonderful, and there's a reason why it's central to really virtually every single piece of fiction, even the apparently plotless novels.
Yeah, there is genuinely no such thing as a purely plotless. They're just. It may feel that way, but no, there is always a beginning, a middle, and an end to a novel.
There's always a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I think it's the degree to which the author chooses to kind of illuminate that artifice is really the question. But I think some of the gifts of plot, which are propulsion, which are propulsion and tension. I think I wanted with this novel to see if I could do that with structure instead. I mean, like the big challenge I had was like, could I use structure to create what people refer to as a kind of plot twist? And so, is it possible to make that kind of moment of surprise, but not through an event, but rather simply through the structure of a book?
I mean, yes, because you do it, but also I'm going back to this idea of the subconscious of the book, right? Like, you could define the subconscious of a book as voice. You could define it as world building. And I keep, plenty of times I've said this before, world building is not just something that you read in science fiction and fantasy. Like, any novel is world building. And yeah, that goes back to the idea that plot happens, right? Like, the change in a character is plot.
Yeah.
And watching what you're doing, and again, I want to go back to the sentences for a second, because I mean, you really do have, and sort of deceptively simple. And it's as we're going and the layers keep happening, and it's just, oh, right. Like, you're just a very clear stylist, which I like quite a lot. But then you get to the end of something and you're just like, that wasn't just a trip to the bakery. where she's standing there and she's just ordering all of the food. It's like she's just going to order everything on the board. And you're like, oh. I
mean, I love pastries, it has to be said.
Yes, I share that love. However, I'm just like, we're not watching a nervous breakdown per se. But we are watching a shift in power as two people stand at a bakery counter. And so when I hear people say, domestic novels aren't political, or domestic novels, nothing happens or whatever, I'm like, well, actually, in the right hands, the subtext and the pointedness is really interesting. And it's a tight cast. It's a really Audition. You don't, even in a separation where we're in Greece, we don't have a cast of thousands. And certainly Intimacies. Yes, we're at The Hague. Still a small cast. An Audition, I feel like, we've got the three mains and then maybe two supporting that really sort of do.
Yes.
But I love that tight cast. And I'm wondering how much of that comes from sort of thinking about playwriting and thinking about dialogue and thinking about sort of the physical interaction of characters in a space, even if it is purely imaginary.
I mean, a lot, I think. I mean, I guess there are two things I would say. One is that, as you know, I mean, I often reread plays before I start writing a novel. And I always remember this thing that the English theater director Declan Donnellan says, which is that the story is in the space between the physical distance and space between characters. That is how the story is told, the kind of blocking. And I think about that all the time in my fiction. I mean, it's very present in Intimacies as well, the kind of architecture of the courtroom and where the characters are in relationship to each other and the kind of power dynamics built into those observations. It was a big part of how I thought about that book. The other thing I would say is, Intimacies was written in 2016 to kind of 2020. It was a novel that was written during the first Trump administration. It was a novel about European but multinational, international institutions coming under immense pressure, whether it was the EU or kind of international crimes tribunal, and the kind of compromised position these institutions, which I believe are of extraordinary importance, were coming under. And it was a book that was about complicity. It was a book about how, as citizens of a country, as parts of a machine, how are we complicit or implicated? Maybe implicated is a better word in the actions of those institutions or countries. And I realized this only really very recently, as in like yesterday. but I mean, I wrote this novel during the pandemic.
Right.
It's not a pandemic novel, there's not a mask or a thing in sight, but the atmosphere in which you're writing always ends up in the novel. So it is a novel about a family in an apartment living together for the first time again and coming under extraordinary pressure. And in that sense, the kind of domestic arrangement was really, really important, the kind of facial movement of these characters. And I think that's part of the reason why it has such a small, tight cast, so that the arrival of a new character would kind of detonate inside this unit, which is already very, very fragile, and whether or not it's a family is again open to which version of the book you're reading. But yeah, I think that's why I like to write that way. I mean, I'm thinking about the book I'm writing now, and it has more characters, but it's I don't think I'm ever going to write a book with dozens and dozens of characters.
No, my experience of your work does not. I mean, yes, the two earlier books are very sort of different in some ways, but you can see the start, right? Like or at least I can see the start of where we got with Separation, Intimacies, and Audition. And I know you and I were talking about it before we started taping. I couldn't remember what year the Longshot came out, but I remember reading it and thinking, wait, who is this woman writing about MMA? Because MMA also was not a thing yet the way it is now. And it was just like, what is going on here? So I just want to go back for a second and talk about that debut, because it was very unforgettable in a lot of ways. But also, it's not the first thing people think of when they think of you.
No. I mean, Miwa, I think you were like the only person who read that.
Yeah. Entirely possible.
I mean, you were like this fairy godmother to that. But I mean, you were really. I mean, it really meant a lot, your support of that book to me, and probably in a larger sense than that is. I mean, I think with every book, I'm always just thinking, will I be allowed to write another one? And I feel like, you're a big part of the reason I was allowed to write another one. I mean, it was the first piece of fiction I ever wrote, ever. I was like, do I know how to do this? It really has essentially two characters and takes
right.
like 3 days. It was really like, what is this thing that I'm trying to do? But I think as you say, some of the thematic elements and maybe even some of the tonal elements where it's a very claustrophobic novel. It's very much a novel that is invested in trying to create this sense of dread. It's a novel that is not that interested in the narrative outcome is kind of obvious from the beginning, and so the tension of the novel is nonetheless we are going to progress towards that narrative outcome. And then it's a novel that in a way is a lot about the performance of masculinity. You know, it's a novel about how men perform, which sadly I think has become relevant again. But this kind of empty performance of power and masculinity, which is always directed towards other men. It's never directed towards women. It's really a little circuit that cuts out women entirely. That's something that is maybe not present in exactly the same way in the other books, but they are all books that are interested again in this idea of how gender performs, when identity performs itself.
And it's 15 years old at this point, and I'm just like, I started rereading it, and I was like, oh, this feels like you could have written it, you know, a month ago, a year ago.
It's interesting because, as you say, that it's, you know, it is set in the world of mixed martial arts, which it's not more violent than boxing, but I think it's definitely true that the aesthetic language of it is not there for us to kind of, you know, everybody knows how to read a boxing match.
Right.
I don't think everybody knows how to read an MMA match, even now, even though it's now become quite a kind of popular sport. But it is interesting how popular it's become over the last 15 years. When I was initially researching it, it was still very much...
It was a fringe thing. It was... And I think that's part of why Longshot sort of hit my radar the way it did, because I was like, what is this combination of author and subject and style? Because again, too, like, there is sort of a grand tradition of novels, right? Boxing. There is a way to write about boxing or basketball or even hockey. You know, there are ways to write about sports and running, whatever. But the idea that... And now we have sports romance, which makes me giggle.
Yes, basketball romance, right?
Yeah, no, all of it totally makes me giggle. But I remember thinking, oh yeah, this is really, I have not seen this before. And every time I get one of your books, I'm like, I have not seen this before. Like, there might be something vaguely familiar, but I know I haven't seen it before, which is the joy of reading you. I'm delighted to know you're working on something else. How cooked is the thing you're working on?
Yeah. I haven't had a chance to get back to it for a while, but it's not uncooked. It's not.
Okay.
It's not uncooked.
Okay.
I think I usually have the novel I'm working on, and then I have the. Sounds like an assembly line, but you know, the novel that's coming after that, which I mean, I have to think about the ideas for a book usually for a couple of years before I start writing. So, you know, I'm usually reading towards the book I'm writing, and then also a little bit towards the book that I want to write after that.
I'm just happy to know there are more coming.
Oh.
I just need more books.
You have a lot. Your bookshelf is much tinier than mine.
These are also the books that have been on the show. So, I mean, this is separate from, there are other, I mean, I'm very happy about what's here, but those are in fact the books that have been on the show. And as I suspected, we're hitting time. And I have to let you go back to the other books. But Katie Kitamura, thank you so much for joining us on Pour It Over. Audition is out now.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Pour It Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.